So as we're about to kick off, I would call it our core Unity work, which is really starting to build our course. It's important to understand performance theory, or how the performance of our course um, is in the game, is in Unity, so that you can be aware as you're working through and you're doing things in Unity, be aware if you break something or you're doing something that's going to negatively impact the performance of your course. So let's talk about performance and what that is. So ultimately, when we talk about performance and how a game is performing, um, it's basically how efficient your course works in the game, how well it renders, and how well the computer resources, things like your CPU, GPU, memory, like RAM, is able to process your course and present it to the game player. The primary method of measuring that is called frames per second. So that's how many times the screen is updated every second. And what we're shooting for at a minimum is 30 frames per second. Because anything under 30 frames per second starts to become noticeable to the human eye, and you'll have people say, hey, that game was laggy or choppy or it's breaking up. And that's when they start to see that stuttering while they're playing the game, and it gets choppy. So we want to shoot for a minimum of 30 frames per second. Um, for us, in the way that when we're building these courses, our performance is typically graphics processor unit bound, the GPU. So when we have these gaming laptops that we need with these dedicated GPUs, the reason we need those high-end GPUs is because we are stressing them. We're putting a lot of impact on them because we have huge scenes inside of Unity. It's a golf course. I mean, it can be kilometers wide, and we have a ton of assets: trees, grasses, meshes, everything in there, lots of stuff moving with wind. And that takes a big toll on the graphics processor inside the computer. So we're typically GPU bound. And this is typically the amount of stuff that you have in your scene is the primary driver of performance issues. Things like, how many trees have you planted, right? Have you planted a lot of trees? The number of grasses that you've planted. Huge meshes can have an impact, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So if you have a really huge, dense mesh with a lot of triangles, that can impact performance. We like to put 3D grass on our courses. That has a huge impact in the way you configure that and the density of that grass, the length of that grass, and then also just misconfigurations. If you have a thing called level of detail misconfigured, it means that you have too much detail in some of your things that very far away, and it can also drive issues with your GPU. So what are the ways to avoid performance issues, or at least mitigate them and learn about them? One is be detail oriented. So when you see these lessons I'm presenting to you, pay attention to what we're doing here and understand the process. And if you're detail oriented, you're going to be aware of what you're doing, and it's going to help you on the long run. One of the biggest things we see with people is also this idea of overplanting. It's really easy just to take a bunch of grass and just spread it all over your course and make it look like nice and thick and lush. Same thing with trees. These mountains over here, or this side of the course is thick with trees in real life, so I'm just gonna put a shitload of trees over here, and it's gonna look really full and lush. That's going to cause you problems, right? You have to be strategic. You just can't go crazy planting stuff all over your course. Um, and then in addition to that, be aware of the items you're placing in your scene. One tree is not equal to another tree. So for example, we have a tree called a weeping willow, and if I remember, I'll show you. But it's a very detailed tree, and if you plant hundreds of those all over your course, you're going to have performance issues. But putting one next to a clubhouse as more of like a feature tree because it's front and center, but just one, that's fine. But so you need to be aware of the items you're placing. I once made the mistake of putting a bush, and I never really thought it was a detail, but it was a very high try count, 25,000 tries, and I put in hundreds of them, and my performance tanked. And I went back and found out it was just this little tiny bush, but whoever developed it put too much detail into that bush for golf courses. Another thing you can do is we'll talk about this, which is avoiding large meshes or retopoing a large mesh. Um, and we did touch that in a little bit with our hole 99, and I cover this in Blender a little bit. And if you've just done 2 holes, that's not going to be an issue quite yet. But once we have 18 holes, and if we have a huge hole 99 encircling that, we might need to break it up or at a minimum retopo it to reduce the number of triangles. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, maybe in an advanced session at the end of the course. Take it easy on the 3DG. So 3DG is 3D grass. Looks great on a course. It really makes a course look fantastic when your ball is lying in 3DG. But if you make it too dense, each one of those blades of grasses, is rendered by your GPU. So you just need to take it easy. And I always do 3DG kind of last because you kind of take whatever performance you have left and you tune the 3DG to take advantage of that, little bit of headroom that you have left before you hit that 30 frame per second mark. Another thing is check your performance throughout your builds process. So as soon as we bring in our meshes into Unity, we're going to immediately do a frame check and just see where we're at. And then from there, every time you add something, look at your performance and see how it impacted performance. Was it a lot? Was it a little? And you're going to get an idea if you pay attention to that in your course building. If you do something like that in the future, you're going to understand, you're going to have a feeling for, hey, boy, that impacted performance a lot, more than I expect. I might have something configured wrong, right? And then the last thing is understand how to benchmark your GPU. And I'm going to show you a couple things right now in regards to that. So let me just open up. This is a course that I built. This is Hershey Links. And you can see that I have my scene, okay, which, I work on and I do stuff in my scene, but I'm going to go into game mode. If I go here to game mode and I hit this play button, my scene renders and I'm looking here through a camera. And then immediately in here, you can see my frames per second is presented to me. Now I know that this particular hole that I'm looking at was my lowest performing hole. And I had it tuned right to about 30 frames per second. Now you have to understand that this frames per second in Unity doesn't always equate to 30 frames per second in game. In my case, it's pretty close, but this is to get a good idea of where you're at, but ultimately we're going to measure this in game, and I'm going to show you that in a second. But this is where we're going to look. So we can look at our try count here. So I got 30 million tries. That's quite a bit for a scene. That's pretty high. 20 million is more acceptable, but I got 30 million in this. But this isn't everywhere. This is the worst spot in my course because I have a ton of trees over here. I got a ton of trees in the background, and I got a ton of grass, and look how thick my 3DG is. But I tuned this to take my course right to around 30 frames per second. So I understand what that benchmark is with my GPU. Now, another thing you have to understand is not all GPUs are created equally. You need to understand that we recommend a minimum of a NVIDIA a 1070 GPU. Just so happens that the GPU I have in this computer is pretty much the equivalent to it. It's a 2060. It's slightly better than a 1070. You need to understand how your GPU compares to the minimum GPU recommended. And here's what I recommend you do to kind of get a feeling for that. So let me back out of here. I'm going to stop my scene here. I'm going to cancel this, pause. And actually, I'm going to pause the video for a second while I prep this next section. So what I would recommend to benchmark your GPU is fire up GSPro on the computer that you're building on, okay, which is typically your sim PC, or maybe you have another computer. Fire up GSPro, and I'm going to go and I'm going to do the screen resolution as what I would normally play at, which is this 920 by 1080. So this is a 1080p, okay? So I'm going to fire this up, hit play, and I can do it in windowed mode because it's the same thing. It's 1080p. And to give you guys an understanding, I'm going to go to practice mode so I can move around the course easily. I'm going to go to on course practice. And Home of the Players was a amazing golf course built by some of the great designers here like Sting, DPR, John, Justin built the clubhouse. And these guys did an amazing job tuning this course so that it just works perfectly at the lowest end GPU. So what I like to do as a GPU benchmark is I load up Home of the Players and I fly around and I load up a couple tee boxes and I see what my frame per second is on this course. And that's what I can get an idea of. If I can match the frame per second that I'm going to see on Home of the Player on the same PC that I'm on when I'm building my own course, then I know that my performance is probably pretty good. I'm going to pause this while this is loading. All right, so I have Home of the Players loaded up. Now in the game, if I hit F until it says VSync off, all right, this is going to let my GPU fly at full speed and max out. So you can see I'm getting about 36 frames per second. So what I do is I just kind of cycle through here. This one's going to be, looks like in the high 20s, level out. So this one's right around 30. Hole 3, we're going to wait till it stabilizes, 36. I'm not going to take you through all the holes, but I do know that the lowest performing hole is going to be about 30 frames per second. And keep in mind, that's because my GPU, which is a 2060, okay, is right around the minimum spec GPU that they say to run GSPro. So those guys did a great job of tuning this course to run at 30 frames per second on a low end 1070 or 2060 GPU. Now, if you load up the course and it runs at 45 frames per second because you have a better GPU than I do, I would make sure that when you build your courses, you want to make sure that they're performing inside of GSPro at about 45 frames per second. Okay? We're going to talk a lot more about performance as we build our courses.